Welcome back to the Click Down. Thanks for joining us today. I'm your host, Steve Beals, and today we're going to have a discussion on Citrix Provisioning, many times referred to as PVS. I'm being joined today by an old friend from my days in consulting, Uzair Ali. Uzi, welcome to the Click Down.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Yeah,
Happy to be here.
I'm really glad you were able to get on. I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have today. But before we dive into anything, maybe you can tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your current role.
Sure. I'm with Citrix Professional Services. I've been with Citrix since 2010. I've been in the consulting division within professional services. Started out of college, worked my way up. I'm now a senior solutions delivery architect.
Awesome. Now, 2010, I think that's when I started in consulting too. It goes back a long way. Yeah. It's funny. I was thinking this morning about this because I knew that you and I are going to be talking about PVS today. And I was thinking actually when I first started using PVS, like when I first actually touched a product, and it was in 2009. And then I realized I'm old. But then it made me think, that there's been so much changes in not only our technology, but, customer data centers, networks, everything, in between. So it was, interesting. And then, I know we kind of set this up beforehand, but, you recently published a blog on updated PVS best practices, which is really why I wanted to talk to you as well. So when we talk about PVS and updated best practices, what's been changed or updated?
Sure. So, a lot of things have changed since 2010, right? You're aware we've gone from a mix of physical and virtual to completely virtual for the most part. We have a new mix of operating systems in the mix, etc. So we've had to adjust some of our best practices, and I know a lot of customers had been asking for a long time, what are the best practices? Different people were disputing different things. Some people said you had to do this. Some people said, no, it's not a good idea anymore. And so a lot of the people on the solutions delivery team, myself included, wanted to put out something that was authoritative, that kind of calmed the storm down a bit on some of these disputed points and just set the record straight. So I decided to, in conjunction with the rest of the SDA team, put together this blog and get input from engineering and product management. So we have a couple of things that we wanted to just let everybody know about. So I think the first thing that's really changed is in the past, we used to recommend modifying the threads per port on each PVS server and also the number of streaming ports. That used to be a best practice, but now we have made advancements in the software and there's really no need to do that anymore. I actually had a customer recently that I'm aware of that used to have, I think, 200 ports per PVS server, and they actually switched it back to 20 ports per PVS server, and they monitored the performance difference, and there was like almost no performance difference. Wow. And they had done that to take advantage of Zen Server's PVS Accelerator feature, but there was no performance difference. So I think that was a real-world example after I published the blog where, what we found in the real world was aligned to what we now recommend.
Great. So with these, new recommendations, was it really just a matter of, as you're working with customers and gathering information from the other architects and engineering, and seeing what's happening in the real world, was it really just a matter of putting that all together to come up with these new best practices?
Yeah, some of it was field experience. Some of it was just things you see people going back and forth about out in that broader EUC community, the end user computing community. So it was a little bit of both. Anything that the SDA team felt that, hey, look, people frequently bring this up. It doesn't make sense to do this, or we should say that people should do this. So any of those types of things that I felt that we had a good, solid answer for, I went ahead and included it on that blog.
Right. And did anything, so there was some things that we updated, right? Things that were being done in the past that needed to be updated to fit in the current environments. Was there anything new on the recommendation side that came out of it?
New, we're no longer using BIOS, so everything is switched over to UEFI now. I think that's probably the newest thing. I don't think there's anything else that would fit that description. I'm thinking about it.
So really,
Yeah, I think a lot of it is more
like what we were doing, and now to kind of fit into the newer environments that we have these days, right?
yeah,
So,
exactly. I think you hit the nail on the head.
what about like minimum versions? So, obviously, we have customers who may be running, some LTSR, versions, or maybe on CR, whatever it is. Are there
Right.
any recommendations on what these new best practices have been validated on version wise?
We validated them on pretty much any PVS version that is currently supported. So, I mean, as long as you're not using something legacy end of life, this is what is recommended
Okay.
for all currently supported versions.
That's great. That's great. I know one of the big things that it's funny. We're asked a lot on feedback on some of our Tech Zone articles around PVS, and this was one of the things that was lingering out there for a while. And I know we started getting answers on that. Is when it comes to networking, we're obviously seeing a lot more 10 gigabit backbones in the networking, and we always had the recommendation around isolating PVS traffic. Has that recommendation now gone away because of the where we are in today's networking world?
Yeah, I don't think isolating the traffic necessarily is a best practice anymore. It used to be when the bandwidth was a lot more constrained back then. You didn't want to potentially choke off your management traffic because of the streaming traffic. But now there's so much. The pipes are so big. It's trivial to put all the traffic on the same pipe. Really, the only customers that would need to do that are those that have security considerations, right? Where there's some kind of compliance or other team dictating that certain types of traffic have to be separate from other types. But for most general customers, everything is sufficient to just use one network interface.
You mentioned security, which is funny. It literally just made me think of something else. I think there's a lot of questions sometimes around security and PVS and having traffic go through firewalls. What's the view on having PVS traffic be firewalled off from other parts of the infrastructure?
Yeah, it's generally a good idea to keep that streaming traffic kind of on an isolated subnet, right? But we wouldn't want to have the streaming traffic cross a firewall. That has always caused issues in any PBS deployment. So as long as it's isolated, the streaming traffic, we're good.
Great. So
I don't know if that answered your question.
no, it definitely answered my question. Yeah, I think again, I know that's come up as well, and some things that we get asked based on the documentation we have out there, and there's always been that recommendation of that you don't want firewalls, the streaming traffic to be firewalled off. So I think it's good that we get that information out there. So as people are maybe designing or using PVS, and if they're having issues, maybe it's something they can look at. So we also introduced PVS, and I'm always from now and forever going to refer to it as PVS. I know it's Citrix Provisioning, but that's just my nature going forward. But
Sure.
we introduced it for Azure and Google Cloud last year. Have you found that any of the customers that you work with are looking to adopt this, or are they primarily still on premises and not really in that discussion path yet?
Most customers that are using PVS today are mostly on-prem. I've had a couple that are kind of interested in it, kicking the tires on it. I think I have one that has deployed it in Azure. So it's something that customers are trying out. We're getting questions about. One question that we commonly get is in one of these two public clouds, can you use one of their managed SQL offerings rather than having to deploy your own SQL server? The answer is yes. It's an interesting question, though, because it's kind of a new world that we're living in.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I assume that as we start as a company and our professional services organization work with more customers in this, we may start seeing some additional or new best practices come out of it. But it's still in the young age of this being introduced.
Yeah.
So when I was in consulting, and again, this is going back some time now, but we used to use a formula to calculate the memory for the PVS server and what it would need. And if I remember correctly, it used to be we would start with around, I think it was 2 gigabits. We would add the number of multi-session disks that we're going to provision. There was a number that we would multiply it by. I think it was 4. We'd add the number of single session OS disks if there were any, multiply that by 2, and then add a buffer. Is that formula that still relevant today and something that you and the team use to recommend size when you're designing and building out PVS?
Yeah, so it's pretty much what you said, right? We use that formula, and the idea is you want to size the PVS server with sufficient memory so it can cache the boot time data that each vDisk needs, so that way it doesn't have to go fetch it while that VM is booting up. So those rough numbers that we give, like 4 gigs for a multi-session OS disk or 2 gigs for a single session OS vDisk, those are roughly the amount that's roughly the quantity of memory that you would need to put on the PVS server so that that vDisk doesn't have to go and get fetched from storage during the boot process, and it stays cached in memory. Your mileage is going to vary a little bit, but it gets you in the right ballpark. And generally, I found, in my experience, it gets you a little bit more than what you need. Sometimes some customers will say, "Oh, look, I have 30 vDisks. This is a lot of memory." Well, we say, well, use that as a starting point, and then you can do testing, and you can always start high and then go low by monitoring in Windows Performance Monitor. There's a counter there called cache copy read hits %, and you can use that to monitor the PVS server memory, and you can see if it is serving up things from its cache rather than going back to storage. As long as that value's over a high number, like 95% or so,
Mm-hmm.
I think that means that it has enough memory and you can afford to potentially reduce the memory there. But really, I mean, the right answer is if you have something like 30 vDisks, the right answer is ask yourself, why do I have to have 30 vDisks? Maybe there's a better way to do this.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Right.
Yep.
Image sprawl. Right.
Right.
That's a whole nother episode we could probably have.
Right.
So when you're meeting with with your customers that you work with, and maybe they're already using PVS, but even if it's newer customers that maybe are looking at PVS and image management for the first time, and the concept of PVS versus MCS comes up. Do you lead with a recommendation? What determines if you're going to go with PVS or MCS? Is it around additional infrastructure that's going to be required for PVS? Is it around storage cost if they're looking at cloud or even on premises, or is it typically around something else?
Yeah, I try to consider things holistically. There's a couple of things that we're getting closer and closer to feature parity between the two, and but there are still some things that one can do that the other one can't do. So, for example, PVS can stream to a physical device. So, if that's a possibility or a use case, then definitely the answer is PVS. Same thing. MCS is the only one that's capable of, for example, streaming to native AWS, right? PVS currently is not supported on native AWS. I believe Nutanix on AWS is supported, but
Yep.
not native AWS. So if you have any of those types of things that only one can do, then the answer is pretty clear there. Otherwise, then I'll also take a look at what is a customer currently doing? What are they comfortable with? Are they happy with their current provisioning strategy? Sometimes they may be just using PVS, sometimes they might be using MCS, and sometimes they might be using something like app layering or a third-party image management tool. And depending on what they have and their interest in moving away from what they have, that can also influence my answer a bit. And then obviously there's scale too. In public cloud, you're going to have the extra infrastructure that comes with PVS, but potentially you might get away with less storage for every target that you're going to be streaming to. So, at very, very large scale, that could be a consideration as well.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, PVS, like I said, working with it back in 2009. I mean, I remember when I first set up my first my first Citrix environment that included PVS, and it blew my mind. And back then, there weren't a lot of documentations and best practices that had been published yet around it, right? I mean, it came to Citrix only a couple years before that. But I remember just going through it, and I was using Zen Server. It was a Citrix virtual apps environment, and I remember like, what is this PVS thing, and doing it, and it literally like I was like in awe, because it was something new, and I got my hands on it. So, it's still a technology that today I'm so excited about, and just to see like the changes we're making and where we're going with it. So it's great to see that you and your team are obviously are staying on top of things, and working with it, and providing new best practices. But I think that that's all the questions I had. So I think that wraps things up for today. Thank you for coming on. It was great to see you. I know everyone that is listening doesn't get to see you, but it was great to see you because we're seeing each other. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to read Uzi's blog on the PVS Best Practices, I urge you to head over to our Citrix blog site. You can go take a look. On top of that, over the next 3 to 6 months, we're also going to be, making sure that we have some newer, documentation and deployment and POC guides on PVS when it comes to deploying it and POCing it in our cloud supported cloud infrastructure. So, keep a lookout for that. But until next time, this has been the Click Down.